Hello and welcome to the full... Oh, apologies there, a wee slip of the keyboard. Hello and welcome to the Full Scottish. My name is Brian Liddy and I'm here on Sunday, the 11th of December. I'm joined by two guests here this morning. First is Simon Barrow. Hello, Simon. Thank you for
Good
joining us.
morning.
And I'm also really pleased to say that we're joined by Councillor Simita Kumar. It's her first time here on the Broadcasting Scotland. Hello, Simita. How are you?
Good morning, Brian. Good to be here.
Really good to have both of you here. Thank you very much. We'll go on to the usual update of what's going on in the Ukraine. This is day 291 before we get into a review of this week's news. The fighting in Ukraine could spin out of control and become a war between Russia and NATO, the head of the alliance, Jens Stoltenberg, said in an interview with Norwegian broadcaster NRK. Iran's backing for the Russian military is likely to grow in coming months, and Moscow will probably offer Tehran an unprecedented level of military support in return, the UK Ministry of Defence has said. The ministry's latest intelligence update said Iran had become one of Russia's top military backers since Russia invaded Ukraine in February, and that Moscow was trying to obtain more weapons, including hundreds of ballistic missiles. Russian forces have destroyed the eastern Ukrainian city of Bakhmut, the country's President Volodymyr Zelensky has said, while Ukraine's military reported missile, rocket and airstrikes in multiple parts of the country. The latest battles of Russia's 9.5-month war in Ukraine have centred on 4 provinces that the Russian President Vladimir Putin illegally claimed to have annexed in late September. Russia wants to turn Ukraine into a dependent dictatorship like Belarus, the wife of jailed Belarusian Nobel Peace Prize laureate Ales Bialatsky said on Saturday upon receiving the prize on his behalf, speaking his words. Bialatsky, the Russian rights group Memorial and Ukraine Centre for Civil Liberties, won the 2022 prize in October. Sorry, I stumbled over my words there. Australia's Foreign Minister Penny Wong said the government would place targeted sanctions on Russia and Iran in response to what it called egregious human rights violations. Moscow has announced it is banning 200 Canadian officials from entering Russia in response to similar sanctions from Ottawa. The Health Minister, Jean-Yves Duclos, and the Canadian Imperial Bank of Commerce head, Victor Dodig, were among those targeted. All non-critical infrastructure in Ukraine's southern port city of Odessa were without power after Russia used drones to hit energy facilities, local officials said, with much of the surrounding region also affected. So that's this week's Ukraine update, or today's update. So Simon, Simita, the first item that we have today is the cost of living crisis and the strikes in particular. So as the number of strikes over the cost of living increase, sorry, I'll say that again, as the number of strikes over the cost of living crisis increase, what more should the government be doing to resolve the disputes? Simita, you work for the NHS and you're also, as an Edinburgh Southside councillor, involved in this kind of thing. Can I ask, what do you think about that?
Yeah, so it's a harsh reality for a lot of workers. The choice between heating and eating is actually growing and growing each day as the cost of living increases. But the reality is that the Scottish Government now has a very finite budget. And if we look at the context of Edinburgh City Council, we had the bin strikes a few months ago. We had the teacher strike outside our chambers just last month. So it is a reality. But the truth of the matter is as well that council's budget, for example, has decreased in real terms because Scottish Government's budget has decreased. But at the end of the day, the inflation has gone up. And workers like myself also have to decide whether, how much money do we have at the end of the month. I don't have any dependents, but I know so many families that I work with where they have children, young people, and they have elderly, and the elderly are now seeking other places to go, sort of your community libraries and things like that, because they can't afford heating. So it's a very sad but a harsh reality. And I think absolutely the government should do more, and it has to come from Westminster as well. It's a shared responsibility, but again, being part of the council, I know that we have to make budget cuts. So it's a yeah, it's a dangerous situation, I think, that really will impact not just the health and the well-being of people, but really the mortality in the end as well.
Thank you, Simita. And I'm just realising, I think I'm chomping at the bit here, really keen to get into today's discussions. But I don't think I introduced either of you to our audience, did I? No. Did I? I'm so keen then. So, Simon, that's a good point that Simita made. I mean, we tend to talk about the Scottish Government when we say, should the government do more? But it's really, the Scottish Government is hampered in its current situation with the strikes. Is that right, would you say?
Well, yes, it is, but let's step back a bit. I mean, first of all, the crisis as a whole is affecting some 1.1 million public sector workers across the UK, and most of those workers have lost around 20% of their income through cost of living and inflation over the last few years. And so, actually addressing that is a really critical thing, and also would benefit the economy. I mean, what the UK government is doing at the moment is stalling on all of these issues. It's going to make cuts in public services, which will make recession worse. Its tax measures actually favour the wealthy rather than those most in need, and what it's doing is stamping on the ability of employers in the public sector to actually make reasonable settlements. And if they did make those kind of reasonable settlements, what we'd find is that you boost demand in the economy, you support small businesses in particular, because public services are vital for that, you cut back on the need for other kinds of expenditure on the welfare budget and so on. So it makes sense to have this rise. But the Scottish Government, you're right, is in a particularly difficult situation, as Simita has said, but that doesn't mean it's powerless. Only BBC has a report which they commissioned from Landman Economics, which suggests some £3 billion worth of revenue that could be generated by using the devolved powers that we have at the moment. And others like the SNP Trade Union Group and so on have also got behind those kind of proposals. It means things like increasing the tax contribution of higher earners. It means things like increasing land and buildings transaction tax. The STUC suggests a target of 240 million, which would be a 30% increase on yields. It means an increase in additional dwelling supplement from the current level of 4% to 8%. That is, premium rates on property taxes on second homes, unoccupied properties, and so on. Increasing Scottish landfill tax by around 30%, which would obviously also benefit the environment. So there are things that the Scottish Government can do, and they really now need to be bold about those kind of things, because, if people are going to see a different future for Scotland, then actually we need to build a bridge between the sensible use of devolved powers, the right use of devolved powers, and the things that can only be done with the powers of independence. And of course, without full economic powers and borrowing powers, the Scottish Government is in a much, much more difficult situation.
Thank you, Simon. Fair points that you made there. Although the Scottish Government wouldn't be able to, for example, introduce windfall taxes. But Samita, as an NHS employee, you'll have had your ballot papers recently asking whether you think nurses or NHS staff should strike. I certainly won't ask how you voted, but what's the feeling that you get from your colleagues in the work environment in the NHS? Are they going to accept the current pay deal, or do you think they're going to strike?
Yeah, thanks, Brian. So I am not in the clinical setting at the moment, and I sit very much, in program management side of things. But when I I remember working so closely with nurses at the Sick Kids, as it was called back in the day. And I remember nurses at that point at band 4, band 5, the scale. So we're talking about, 24, 25,000, and working around sometimes a very thankless task. So I do absolutely believe that our nurses, deserve a very equal and fair pay. I definitely don't speak on behalf of them, but having seen the amount of work they do, the hours they do, and sometimes actually sacrificing their own health and well-being for patient care. And I think it's about time that we fully recognize the pay that they do deserve. I mean, over the pandemic, when everyone was working around the clock, everybody was coming out on a Thursday, giving applause for the tireless efforts of not just that. It's not just about the nurses as well. Think about the orderlies. Think about everyone who's involved in NHS, from your administration staff to your porters to your cleaners. There is a wealth of people uh, around our NHS who really deserve a fair pay, and I think the idea that we can, as Simon had said, a lot of our taxes are really benefiting the wealthy. But actually, think about your nurses, think about all of your amazing staff who actually do deserve a fair pay. And I think that consensus is very much there from my colleagues that I've heard, that they do deserve a fair pay. And strike is the absolute last thing that anybody wants to do, because at the end of the day, everyone's very passionate about patient care. That's what, in NHS. That's why we're involved in health and social care. But at the end of the families we have, we also need to be able to heat our homes, be able to travel, and these are real cost is increasing. So the colleagues that I've spoken to are very, very conscious about patient care. It's the right time that we know more of their voices as well. So yes, I won't be able to start voting just yet. Totally, totally in solidarity with my fellow colleagues, and nurses especially.
Thank you, Simita. It'll be interesting if we do see NHS workers on picket lines in the coming weeks. Simon, just for you, I wonder, have you got any clue as to why Labour have refused to commit to repealing the new anti-trade union laws?
Well, I mean, it's Keir Starmer refused to say that he would repeal those laws. I'm afraid that's not really new within Labour at the moment. Even worse, Keir Starmer has said that not only has he dropped the idea of re-engaging with the European Union, but also the single market and the customs union. I mean, it's a quite extraordinary position for Labour to take. But I mean, just to come back on a comment that you made, Brian, yes, the Scottish Government can't introduce windfall taxes. Lots of things the Scottish Government can't do, but actually what we need to do, because the budget is next week, is to focus on the things that the Scottish Government can do. And I outlined a number of those things the Scottish Government can do, and it shouldn't make excuses for this. Yes, overall, it's extremely constrained by the financial situation. It desperately needs those powers. We need to be clear about that. Within the trade union movement, I think there needs to be a debate that recognises that on the one hand, the Scottish Government isn't doing as much as it could be doing. And I mean, the STUC report sets out in considerable detail the way that it can use its powers. I hope John Swinney starts to respond to that. It's not just about the budget next week, it's also, of course, about the tax settlement spring next year. But at the same time, we need to get realistic. If we want strong and defendable public services, decent paying conditions and so on, Scotland actually needs those full economic and full tax powers, which it doesn't have at the moment. It also needs borrowing powers. That's one thing that Gordon Brown did suggest in his report, which I think we'll come back to later. So it's a question of, yes, there are things we can do now. Yes, the situation is constrained overall. And yes, of course, the burden of responsibility is lying with the Westminster government, which is handling this entirely wrongly. And unfortunately, Labour doesn't really seem to be offering any real alternative on that. So once again, the people of Scotland are confronted with some stark choices if we want to move in a better direction now and in the future.
Thank you, Simon. I really am happy to apologise to you, because I did realise even within myself that when I brought up windfall taxes, and then I moved on really quickly, so it sounded really clipped, and it really wasn't meant to be a cut off or anything. I totally accept the suggestions that you've made. I'm happy to make that clear. But the next item then is the Democrats' hold of Georgia in the runoff in the American election. So this week, the Reverend Raphael Warnock held his Georgia seat in the US Senate, which gives the Democrats an overall majority in the Senate. That was the case until Kristen Sinema announced that she was sitting as an independent. And she was elected on a promise to lower drug prices, and then Big Pharma donated $750,000, I think, to her personally. So now she opposes a bill on the that she stood on, which was to reduce drug costs. And she's now opposing a bill to lower drug prices. I wonder who to go to first on this. Simon, you're probably paying more attention to things in America than I am. What do you have to say about this?
Well, yeah, I mean, I do pay a fair bit of attention to things in America because I'm married to an American, amongst other things. So these are of considerable interest. I mean, well, first of all, it's really good news that Raphael Warnock managed to win that runoff. It was always going to be very, very tight. He secured his first full 6-year term, and effectively he's had sort of to face 4 elections in 2 years, really. And he's a really important figure because he's extremely articulate. He's an advocate for progressive causes. His mother, of course, was a sharecropper, so he comes from that kind of background in poverty. He's a Baptist pastor with an interest in liberation theology. So he kind of, that because of my own background, that interests me as well. And he saw off Trump-supported Herschel Walker, who was a very, very poor candidate in spite of being a kind of sporting celebrity in America. So that's good news. And yes, it's good news that there's a 51-49 Democrat majority in Senate. But of course, the House can mess this up quite considerably. And as you pointed out in your introduction, with Kirsten Sinema. I mean, that one of the real problems in American politics is the way so many politicians on both sides of the aisle, it has to be said, are effectively owned by big corporate interests. The pharmaceutical industry, particularly the fossil fuel industry as well. They invest enormously in politics in America, and it's very clear what their aims and intentions are. So it's a piece of good news, along with the other recent news of the election in Brazil and the re-election of Lula and the defeat of a far-right candidate who was going to destroy the Earth's lungs in the rainforest there. So there are some good things happening on the agenda, but nevertheless, it's going to be a huge uphill struggle because it's really frightening the extent to which the hard right in America has managed to, well, effectively con a huge number of voters into thinking that the last election, the presidential election, was somehow rigged. Absolute nonsense. So there are real threats to democracy in America at the moment, and someone like Raphael Warnock is actually a symbol of hope in the opposite direction.
Thank you, Simon. And Simita, I mean, the word that springs to my mind when I'm listening to what's going on and what Simon's just been saying is greed, really. Would you agree, or is that too harsh a word to use?
I think we could perhaps be even harsher, to be honest. But the idea that Big Pharma actually controls a lot of the democracy in America is actually really frightening, really challenging. So we know about Kirsten Sinema, but what about others we don't know? And that's a frightening aspect. So we know the addiction that people have to opioids, to whatever drugs out there, but then people who do need drugs when they are unwell can get access to it because the prices are too high. In some ways, we're so blessed, we're so lucky to have a brilliant system of NHS. I know it's not perfect, but it does work. And on the side, to understand that the Big Pharma has such a monopoly is actually frightening. But even if we look back onto COVID times, and the the way that people did get together in terms of producing these drugs. But remember, these came at a huge cost, and a huge cost in terms of to governments, etc. And I know at the time we absolutely needed this to actually, get COVID under control. But then on the flip side, you have to actually wonder on the monopoly, like I said, that the pharma has, and how they are influencing decisions. Some we are, we might know about, others we don't know about, and to me that is something that really sits uncomfortably with me. So unlike Simon, I perhaps don't follow American politics enough, but I do understand some of the real issues that they have, and such a long way to go. So I totally agree. I think greed is there, but I think perhaps corruption and democracy is also some of the words that I'll apply, because these are challenging times, and I do wonder how impact on future generations. I mean, I won't even touch on the antimicrobial resistance and things like that. But yeah, it is a challenge and something about.
Thank you, Simita. I'll move on to the next item, which is about corruption in high places in America, but perhaps also comparing it to what's been going on in Germany recently. Donald Trump in particular. Simon, I'll ask you. I haven't given very much of an introduction here, but there's so many things that have been going on with Trump and what he's been accused of in the courts, and he's facing trials. Is the law close close to finding Trump guilty, do you think, of tax fraud? And could he still face charges over the 6th of January coup on the Capitol?
Well, yeah, I mean, the question of whether and how Donald Trump will face justice, both for his involvement in the effectively coup attempt on the 6th of January and in terms of his own tax affairs and many of his economic dealings. I mean, he inherited a lot of wealth. He managed to lose some of that. He retained wealth by effectively swindling thousands of people, really. And he hasn't so far faced justice. The noose of justice seems to be tightening. But who knows whether he will end up in court and even end up in jail. I think there's a lot of cynicism about that, because, of course, one of the things that Trump successfully attempted to do was to pack the Supreme Court. And right across the country, his party, the Republicans who are in hock to him, are seeking to effectively fix democracy in their direction by all kinds of voter suppression, and also to use the powers that they have to affect the judicial system in their direction as well. Again, a very dangerous situation. So whether and how Trump will come to justice is still very much an open question. But, it also raises issues of corruption in other parts of the world as well, including our own.
Thank you, Simon. You mentioned voter suppression there, which reminds me of the Dominion voting machine. Apparently, there's a defamation case which the company that makes the Dominion voting machines are taking against what Trump and his followers have been saying. And do you think, would that maybe bring down Fox News, that often covers these stories?
Well, again, I'm sure people would be delighted if it did manage to make a dent or even bring down Fox News. Again, it's an uncertain situation, but certainly when you're effectively slandering big corporations like Dominion and so on, and they start to use their legal muscle, you're in a pretty perilous situation. And again, I think the most important thing in this is, well, I mean, it would be really important to bring Trump and other conspirators to justice on these questions, but it's actually to establish truth. It's really alarming that a very large number of Republican voters and voters overall still believe the lies that were told about the last election. That's extremely dangerous. People are kind of being cocooned into their own news ghettos, if you like, and that's bad for democracy as a whole. So, we hope that kind of action can continue to raise in the public domain the question of the lies that have been told and the need to actually strengthen democracy rather than to undermine it.
Thank you, Simon. And Simita, thinking about corruption in high places, then this country isn't immune either. We've got Michelle Mone, haven't we? And her Michelle Mone and her millions and her poor PPE. Again, somebody who's got experience of working in the NHS when we've going through the pandemic. What have you got anything to contribute on that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think again, it's going back to the idea that we have people who have been democratically elected are actually working in favor of the upper 1%. There was strong evidence that the government was getting charged. Now I can't remember the figures, but it was twice as much or 4 times as much of what the PPE would have cost. So despite having all the evidence, they actually decided to award the contract to somebody that Michelle knows or to her friends and her family. Now, on a small scale, we are asked to justify absolutely every penny that we use or ask for and really scrutinize the process. And it makes me wonder where the scrutiny was when these things were happening. Now, I understand that over the pandemic, things had to move very quickly, very fast, and really to, like I said, to react to the situation. And I work in public health, so I know that there's lots of scenarios that we do in planning for pandemics. But the idea that Michelle One can actually get away with these things, or that it was approved in the first place, like where was the scrutiny then? It really, really baffles me. But again, this is going back to my earlier point. This is one of the things we now know about. I wonder what other contracts were given out to friends and family without proper scrutiny, without proper review, and it's challenging our democracy. It's also understanding that these are taxpayers' money. This is my money. This is your money. This is all of our money, and we are, instead of going back to workers' right, going back to what workers deserve, instead of paying for that, we are actually ensuring that our upper 1% stays there, because they have an unfair advantage, because they have the ear of people who are in leadership roles, who have an absolute responsibility to make a good for the public. And it's just baffling. It's just baffling how good scrutiny was, it seemed to have been done away with. Where was the good value? Where was the good scrutiny? So it's remarkable. It's remarkable that it's happened. But I'm glad it's getting the light of the day. But in some ways, the taxpayers' money is already down the drain. So yeah, something that I hope, like talking about Donald Trump, I do hope that we can bring people to justice, or at least really understand what's happened and make sure this process is in place to really stop that. You'd think that it already happens in the government and every public place, but this brings it to question, really, for me.
Thank you, Simita.
Yeah. I mean, just to add to that, if I could, I think the important thing is that we should be looking towards supporting things like the Good Law Project or the Byline Times or Open Democracy, other kind of citizen-based initiatives which, both through the media and through the law, are trying to hold government to account on those kind of questions. Because as Simita says, it's a much wider issue. I mean, in terms of PPE contracts, public health contracts, you're talking about £38 billion worth of money, much of which has still not in any way been accounted for, by the UK government within Parliament. We've now discovered that with the ludicrous decision to start coal mining again, the Cumbria coal mine that's come into the headlines recently is actually owned by a private equity firm in the Cayman Islands. One of the things that is being ignored to a certain extent is that Rishi Sunak, represents a certain kind of diversity. There was a lot of publicity around that, but he's also really Britain's first Goldman Sachs prime minister. He himself and his family are worth £750 million, and all their interests are tied up with the super wealthy. The fossil fuel industry is putting money into the Conservative Party and other parts of the political system. that they're affecting public policy in that way, in the same way as, for example, the insurance industry in the United States has effectively a stranglehold on health policy and is preventing a single payer system being introduced by being able, frankly, to buy politicians. So the larger question that we have in the UK and the US and in certain other parts of the world is that democracy is increasingly being owned by big money. And that's a real danger. We need to reinsert democracy, real political democracy, into the system and constrain big money.
Thanks, Simon. I was going to ask you what you thought of the Mon situation, but and I'm really keen to find out what you both think about what's been happening in Germany recently, because for me, with the Heinrich the 13th, because for me it chimed with what happened in America at the Capitol on January 6th. But before we do move on to that, just because we've been talking about Michelle Mon and the millions that she made out of PPE, if we look at it in a wider picture, if we look at the tens of billions of pounds that the government spent on PPE contracts in general and on test and trace, and we're looking at public sector workers in the NHS and other important sectors asking for a wage increase. Do you think, Simon, I'll ask you first, is there any chance that those tens of billions of pounds can be gotten back and then perhaps could be used to give people real living wage rises?
Well, I think the problem is that once money has gone, it's very difficult to get it back. But certainly there are likely to be, I think, some legal cases coming up, which will be important. Of course, the real issue in terms of bringing money back into the economy is to be able to levy tax on those large corporations who control much of our social media and our lives today, who are effectively not paying any tax at all in some cases, or very small sums of tax. So, also controlling tax havens and so on. That's really where far more government action is needed. And again, there are concrete proposals on the table which could strengthen that, but the UK government doesn't really seem interested in doing anything other than tinkering around the edges. In fact, what they've said recently is that they're actually going to loosen regulation within the City of London. There was very inadequate regulation introduced after the 2008 financial crash. They're going to actually rein back on some of that, which really shows where their interests are. And again, it's allowing money to run democracy rather than democracy to run money. And of course, that money is desperately needed at the moment for 1.1 million public sector workers, for strengthening our public services. The NHS in England is in a catastrophic situation. It's in a bad situation in Scotland as well. And of course, part of that is a consequence of what happens down south because of the way the system works at the moment. So there's a desperate need to invest in a different future, but we don't have a government that's willing to invest. We don't have a government that's willing to challenge big money interests. We don't have a government that's willing really to relook at its tax powers and other powers that it has. And again, this puts Scotland in a very dependent situation, which is something that we all need to be aware of and challenge.
Thank you, Simon. I'm really keen that I fulfil my promise to talk about what's happened in Germany recently, but it's so tempting because you're talking about the Chancellor's plans. Mr. Hunt, he wants to break down the regulations that Gordon Brown put in place to stop the crisis in 2008 happening again, which I think probably just shows how desperate the Westminster government is. But really love to talk about that, but we really need to cover that German thing. We don't have a lot of time. So democracy came under attack in Germany recently when Prince Heinrich the 13th and 24 of his supporters were arrested on Wednesday, suspected of planning a coup d'etat, which involved 3,000 police officers. So this had echoes of Trump's supporters storming the Capitol. I'll just put it very simply, is that coming from the same place? Simita, what do you think? Is there a relationship?
I think there is. I think it's one that sort of slightly, rings a bit close to home. I'm originally from Fiji. We've had our fair share of coups in the past, but to me, from a world leader like Donald Trump, that's putting it very light, everyone knows what I think of him. But for him to actually go out and actively encourage right-wing supporters to come down to the capital to do the riot is sending a strong message that it's okay to do these things. It's absolutely okay, because if your leader, if your head of state says it's okay, then of course it's okay. That's the message he's portraying. And now we've actually seen that in Germany, where it's so right wing that again, trying to actually overthrow a government, these are serious issues. We've talked about the challenge it is to democracy. One, like I said, I've unfortunately had to grow up in and understand some of the consequences around it. It's dangerous, because I think we're seeing, not perhaps to the same extent, but I fear that we might see something similar in different aspects in the UK and other places, as the very right wing are given a platform to spread a lot of misinformation. We were talking about Fox News earlier. Remember that their news is so singular. It's not diverse in any way, and they are being fed whatever actually moves the agenda ahead. So I think, just to go back to your question, I think there's an absolute link. I think it's something that we all should be cautious and conscious about, because we're already seeing some of this happening in the UK, perhaps on a smaller scale. But yeah, I'd be very fearful that we might see these things in a bigger context in the UK.
Thank you, Simita. Simon, if we're all going to get home on time today, if you could say something just really quickly about that.
Absolutely. Well, I mean, first of all, I mean, this is an absolutely extraordinary story, of a prince whose family used to rule that region of Germany for hundreds of years before World War One, going with others to a neo-Gothic hunting lodge and planning to destroy German parliamentary democracy and replace it with a monarchical system. I mean, the difficulty is you would almost laugh at that, but I mean, as you said, this was an operation by the German security forces involving 3,000 officers. They searched 150 properties. They arrested 25 people in total, one of whom actually is a judge, another is a celebrity chef. Again, the difficulty is that it's easy to laugh at this, but there is a really serious and growing threat of the far right across Europe. And this was a serious plot involving quite a large number of people. Simita's already drawn the parallel with the 6th of January in the United States. We often forget that in the 1940s in the United States, there was a growing Nazi movement. There was a Catholic priest on the far right who had a radio show that reached around about 30% of the population. There were people who were definitely involved in a plot to try and overthrow the government. Of course, this was all ended when America actually entered the war on the side of the Allies, but it was a real serious threat. It led to people going into court, unfortunately being let off. But there's a whole story there. If you listen to the American journalist Rachel Maddow's podcast called Cllr, you'll hear the full story. There are quite a number of examples of the far right, both back in history and now increasingly in the present, posing a real threat to democracy. And, with the kind of dislocation of the political system overall, this becomes a greater threat. So it's something we should pay real attention to.
That's great. Thank you, Simon. I mean, we're eating into the time that we've got left to speak about other things. But the next item is Gordon Brown's plans to reform the United Kingdom. So Labour have now pledged to abolish the House of Lords upon their inception if they get power in the next government. The third sentence in the report, I'm sorry, I'm getting garbled. So the third sentence in the report says that the current crisis we face is caused by COVID, the war in Ukraine, and energy price rises and inflation, that otherwise known as a cost of living crisis. There's no mention of Brexit in that sentence being a cause, and Brexit is only mentioned twice in the entire document. That tends to be quite a passing reference. Which I'll just a couple of things out that were planned. So the plan is to strengthen and protect the Sewell Agreement, when I think we probably would think that the Sewell Agreement is a good chance. You could say that it's flawed. So I'm not sure why would we want to protect something that's flawed. They say that they're no longer going to devolve and forget, which does sound good, but the opposite of that then, to my mind, sounds like they're going to devolve and then interfere. We're going to say that Scotland would be allowed to enter into international agreements such as Erasmus, and yet again Brexit, the reason we're not in Erasmus at the moment is because we were taken out of the European Union against our will. I could go on. Who to come to first? Simon, what's your opinion?
Okay, well, I mean, it's a little difficult not to be cynical about this. Labour has been talking about getting rid of the House of Lords or replacing the House of Lords for around about 122 years now, and nothing has happened when it's been in government. Here's another promise. The idea of a kind of House of the Regions would still put Scotland in an institutional minority, and it would probably only have sort of checking powers on the main house anyway, and it's absolutely no substitute for the kind of powers that we would get under independence when you look at the kind of economic powers that the UK government holds. You know, personal allowance and national insurance are retained by the Treasury, capital gains tax, corporation tax, VAT, excise duties, you know, and I mean, the reason I'm raising those is, of course, that the economy is at the forefront of our attention at the moment. So, you know, Brown's report contains some sensible proposals, for England and for those areas of England that don't have effective economic powers themselves, you know, after the coalition government scrapped England's regional development agencies back in 2010. So that's good. But as you mentioned, the Commission really only makes one single solitary change to the Scotland Act, and that is recommending the reservation of foreign affairs to Westminster being tweaked to allow Holyrood to enter into international agreements and join international bodies. That would be a good thing. It also, in fairness, mentions borrowing powers coming to Scotland. But it doesn't affect any fundamental change, and even Labour really doesn't seem to have, you know, put much publicity weight behind this, really. So it's a bit of a damp squib. There are some interesting things to discuss in it, but it doesn't provide any kind of alternative to Scotland really regaining the full powers that it needs within the economy, within security and international affairs, and so on. You know, it's such a half-hearted measure that's so obviously a political move to try and shift political opinion in Scotland, but it doesn't fundamentally make any difference.
Thank you, Simon. Simita, my question for you is probably echoes what Simon said. Is do you think it's enough? I mean, for me personally, if I was in the room with Gordon Brown, then I would be asking him, would his reforms mean that Scotland would be able to trade freely with the European Union? I don't think it would. Would it mean that workers from the EU could come back to Scotland and stay? I don't think it would. And would it mean that Scotland would have power to have a referendum on independence? Again, I don't think it would. So would it have stopped us? Would it have stopped Brexit? I don't think it would. Would it have stopped the Supreme Court coming out with their decision? I'm sorry, I'm talking. I'll let you answer. What do you think?
Well, I very much echo a lot of what Simon has said. Every time I hear anyone mentioning abolishing House of Lords, a part of me gets overjoyed, and then a second later, I'm like, I'll believe it when I see it. Of course, Simon has mentioned, you know, this was one of Labour's promise going back 122 years. So I'd like to find somebody who remembers that, because it's existed in most of our history. So I don't put much stock into it. But also, I think Gordon Brown's solution is actually we'll try and put a bandage on a broken system, because we want to do what's best for Scotland. So we'll just give you little bits of things to actually work on. Now, I'm coming from a very working class family in a traditionally Labour voting family, but they have lost a lot of credibility for me. As you know, Labour is in administration in City of Edinburgh Council, as they are in other councils, because they've gone into this de facto coalition with the Tories and Lib Dems purely to prevent a majority of the voters, what the voters have voted for in terms of SNP and Green, and are very looking independent thinking parties. So everything that Gordon Brown offers, it's a little, it's it perhaps won't work, but B, it's a broken system. Why are we trying to put bandages on a broken system, and what does that actually mean for Scotland? I hear a lot of, okay, well, this is what Scotland needs. Let the people decide. Let the people decide what they want and what they need. Giving us powers and drips and drabs doesn't actually help us, doesn't help the economy, doesn't help us to progress. Like Simon said, there are a couple of things that are actually of value, but overall, it's for Scotland to decide. And yeah, like I said, don't put a lot of stock in his reform plans, unfortunately.
Thank you, Simita. So we'll move on to the next item now, which is what's happening in Westminster for the SNP party down there. Ian Blackford stepped down recently, as I'm sure you both know, and we now have Stephen Flynn as the new leader of the Scottish National Party in Westminster. His first question and Prime Minister's questions referenced the recent poll, the 3 polls recently even that are pro-independence for Scotland, and we now have a list of his new cabinet, which I'm just trying to track down here, which is very interesting. I'll just try and pick a couple out. We've got Murray Black as his deputy leader, Stuart Hosey is in the cabinet as the economy spokesperson, Alison Thewlis is Home Affairs spokesperson, Alan Smith is there for Europe and EU accession, as you might expect. Kirsten Oswald, who was in the previous cabinet, is there for women and equalities. Alan Brown is there for energy and industrial strategy spokesperson. He's been doing a lot of good work on that. And we have John Nicholson for digital culture, media and sport. Again, I'm conscious that I'm talking too much. Simita, I'll come to you as an SNP councillor. What do you think of the new cabinet?
Yeah, so I think with the change of leadership, I think the leader should feel confident to equip his cabinet with people he has trust in, people that he thinks are right for the job for him to do a good job. So, absolutely, I think that's fair to actually do a reshuffle. I think it's not a bad thing in some ways, because it means that everyone gets to skill themselves. It's always quite nice to go into a different area for people as individuals. I know that's something that I quite appreciate. My only reservation around the front bench was I would have liked to see more women. Not surprisingly, but I would have loved to see more women, because we have some fantastic women in Westminster. So it's about utilising their fantastic skills as well. But equally, this is Stephen's shot at getting things right, and yeah, it's interesting to see. It's interesting because we do have such fantastic people already in the cabinet. So interesting times, let's just say, and it'll be good to see how we are putting our foot forward for a very progressive challenge, a real opposition at Westminster, but also to really ensure that our voices are heard around independence, and how do we actually make a democratic way forward to actually get an independence vote. And I think, it's good to place a lot of confidence in Stephen, and ensuring that the cabinet he has allocated are going to deliver that job for us, but also on other really important issues like energy, like transport, like European Union. So it'll be really good to see how the group comes together and works together and moves the party forward.
Thank you, Simita. That's a good point about the gender balance. I just did a quick tally. There are 8. I didn't mention them all. I didn't read out the entire cabinet. There are 8 women in the cabinet. There's Deirdre Brock, Kirsty Blackman, and our very own Carol Monaghan, who often joins us here at Broadcasting Scotland. And maybe then on the back of that, it would be interesting. Maybe it'd be good to see also more people of colour and BAME backgrounds. But Simon, I'll ask you the same question. What do you think of the new cabinet?
Yeah, well, I mean, first of all, the kind of diversity you were just referring to, you'd need to elect some people for that to be possible. There's been a kind of lot of speculation around political infighting behind the ascendancy of Stephen Flynn to the leadership in the Commons of the SNP and the appointment of a new cabinet. I'm not terribly interested in that. Probably of the people mentioned, I'm particularly pleased that Chris Stevens, who's a really good trade unionist, is moving into the levelling up agenda. I think that'll be a really good step forward. Stephen Flynn himself is a somewhat unknown quantity in terms of his politics, beyond obviously the question of independence. The thing that is of a bit of concern to me is that he has come out in support of carbon capture, which I think is an untested technology, not the right way to move towards a just transition. He's also been supportive of free ports and green ports, which I think is absolutely disastrous and against SNP policy. So I have a few concerns there. But I think we need to look at the broader picture, really, which is that the SNP has been in government in Scotland for 15 years. It has a very large swathe of MPs at Westminster. Now very much is the time for renewal. You mentioned the opinion polls swinging in the direction of independence. That's encouraging. It's important to realise that since 2014, we've only been ahead on the independent side in 8 out of 32 of the opinion polls that have taken place. The country is still very much balanced. And so we need really a new offer to the Scottish people in terms of independence. And I'd like to see 2 things. I'd like to see, first of all, a campaign based on a people's claim of right, really. Because a large swathe of people, whatever their view on the constitutional issues in Scotland, believe in things like strong public services and a secure NHS. They believe in a vibrant and fair economy with access to European markets. They want decent jobs, pay, conditions. Things like a universal basic income and homes for all guarantee would be a real game changer. And of course, critically, Scotland's green energy future in our hands. We have something like 35% of Europe's on and offshore renewable energy potential. The question is, who will decide about that? And also, who will own it? And that's a very serious question as well. So I want to see within the SNP, within the Greens, within all of those in the Yes movement, a period of renewal in which we make a fresh offer that can bring new people to the cause, really. I'd also love to see the Scottish Government, when it sets a budget, not only setting a budget for effective use of devolved powers and being bold about that, as we talked about earlier, but also indicating what more it could do with the powers of independence so that we build a bridge between the use of devolved powers and the powers that we need under independence. That's the kind of change that I want to see, not just within the SNP, but more widely within the Yes movement. And I would hope that a change of guard, if you like, at Westminster will be part of the renewal of that group. And we also perhaps need a bit of renewal within the Scottish Government and its purpose as well. So I'd like to see it move in that direction. Whether it will is another question, but I think it's pressure from the grassroots always that changes people in leadership positions and encourages them to be more bold. And we need to see that. We've seen action from the STUC. I think we need a Yes movement that now really focuses on the political task of winning more people over, because 51, 56%, yeah, that's great in opinion polls, but that needs to happen over a very sustained period of time, and then it becomes impossible to refuse the kind of referendum that we will need in order to determine that constitutional future. It's only a political solution that we have now. We have to give up in arguing about the legal niceties of it and focus on that new offer, what I've called a people's claim of right for Scotland.
Thank you, Simon. I thought it was an interesting cabinet selection Pete Wishart wasn't there after he had stepped down, and yet there are other people who were in the previous cabinet and who had also stepped down, and they're now in the new cabinet, which I think maybe I'm a bit naive. I think it maybe shows that there isn't any spite or any malice between Stephen and his colleagues, which again, Simon, you touched on about press saying that there's a split in the SNP, but going back to that recent the rise in the pro-independence polls, which you talked about, Simon, how much do you think is that what seems like this could 3 new polls with a rise? How much of that is due to external factors that the Scottish Government haven't got any control over? I mean, it's Brexit, the cost of living crisis, and the Supreme Court ruling. Again, Simita, do you think? What do you think?
Yeah, thank you. It's interesting to see this now consistent polls coming in with an increase in independence polls. But yes, there are lots of external factors. Let's not lie. There's lots of things that have happened. For example, Brexit. For example, Westminster constantly thinking that the law doesn't apply to them. For example, the cost of living crisis, of course, or the cost of the rise in energy prices in a very energy-rich Scotland. These are some of the things that people are very conscious about. But I think people are just tired and frustrated now because time and time again we get told that actually we'll absolutely listen to Scotland. Scotland is a part of the UK and we'll absolutely give it its due. And time again people have felt let down by the system that actually says that more devolved powers. Now I voted no in the 2014 independence referendum, and I regretted that decision the morning of when David Cameron came out and did his speech, and I knew at that point that I had made a mistake. Now, for a lot of people, Brexit has changed things, or other things have changed, but people have seen since 2014 in real terms what the changes have been. And I think, the polls are great to go by, but when I have been out canvassing, I've been in my area, we have a really large Labour supporters who a lot of them are pro-independent as well. A lot of Liberal Democrats, we now have our Liberal Democrats for Yes movement going as well. And I wouldn't be surprised if there are also Tories who support an independent Scotland, maybe perhaps not vocally, but they do, because even they recognise what's needed for Scotland, what's right for Scotland. So again, the polls are interesting, but like Simon said, it has to be something that's quite consistent and quite sustained. So I'll be looking forward to actually going out with my fellow colleagues, canvassing and really understanding what the word on the street is as well, and to actually answer some of people's questions and fears around what it might mean around an independent Scotland, because there are lots of questions that still need to be answered. But I think independence is the right direction for Scotland, and a lot of people are understanding that to be absolutely the right direction as well. So interesting to see the polls, and very positive to see it on the rise as well.
Thank you, Simita. Thank you for your honesty there in that answer. And you mentioned that there's lots of questions still to be answered. And you also mentioned Labour supporters who support the idea of independence. And we're really up against it time-wise. But Simon, there's the SNP have also published 20 questions which they would like answered on the back of Gordon Brown's independent report. So Simon, I'll just maybe quickly ask you one of those questions. I've just chosen it after what you were saying, Simita. Question number 11. Anna Sauer claims there is not a majority for another referendum or on independence, considering he said mandates were based on elections and not polls, and considering there is a majority of MSPs for both in the Scottish Parliament. What is he basing that claim on? Sorry, I didn't read that very clearly there. Did that come over?
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I think these are important questions, but they're not the most important questions. Most people in Scotland don't first and foremost, I think about independence. There's a solid base for independence, and there are others who think about it when they're asked about it. But people are really concerned with their homes, with the future of the NHS, with jobs, etc. So we have to root an offer of independence within that context, the real difference it can and should make to Scotland. And that only looks convincing if the Scottish Government are using to the maximum the powers that it has at the moment and mapping out what more could be done, a new vision for Scotland, so that independence becomes the answer to a question about how we achieve a better, fairer, greener Scotland. And we haven't really succeeded in doing that so far, because we shouldn't delude, in spite of Boris Johnson, in spite of Brexit, in spite of many other shocks to the economy and the cost of living crisis, we're still in a kind of 50-50 situation. More people need to be persuaded, and what will persuade them is rooting the case for independence in that new offer of a better Scotland that offers them a better future. And we have to be really solid about that. We can build a big coalition, because those 40% of people in the Labour Party who support independence would get behind the kind of demands that I'm talking about as well, and we might be able to swing more people over. That's rather than, asking questions to people we know won't answer them. That's what we need to do.
Thank you, Simon. Well, that's the end of the show. So thank you to both of our guests. Thank you, Simita, and thank you, Simon. Really appreciate you giving it part of your weekends for us here. So tomorrow's edition of Scotland at 7 will be hosted by Andrew Wilson, so make sure to tune in then. So really, all that's left for me to do is to stop talking and to let you all get on with what's left of the weekend. But before I do go, just remember we have a crowdfunder on, so if you could visit our website and please sign up to help support us, then we would be very much appreciate. We're very, very grateful. So thank you, and we'll see you all next week. Cheerio.